So to describe myself, I'm a white male in his 30s with a kind of crap beard that I need to shave, short hair, wearing a plaid shirt from the 90s. And in case you haven't noticed already, my voice is cracking today, which is perfect because I'll be testing my imposter syndrome for the next hour, talking about your content strategy, which is a fun topic because anyone who's tried to make a content strategy rapidly realizes that it turns into a whole organization strategy. But this talk, I'll be going over what kind of research needs to go into doing a content strategy and 4 main areas which I think are worth focusing on, and little tips and tricks along the way of how you can smooth the process. Because if you're not careful, it can rapidly turn into a huge beast. But first, it's worth asking why bother with a digital content strategy. And the most basic one, I could have got some Office for National Statistics to back this up, but just trust me, essentially. Audiences already primarily use the internet to find out things to do, things to buy, and ways to enjoy themselves and waste their time online. And if you are not there with an offer for all of those different needs that your current or prospective audiences might need, then you're eventually going to become irrelevant. Which sounds very drastic, but I think is actually just true. Maybe not next week, maybe not next month, but as time goes on, if you don't have some sort of presence and you're not treating content with the respect it deserves, then you will not be fit for the future. And I say treating content with respect because a lot of us fall into this trap of being almost accidental publishers, that we publish things online, but they're always kind of attached to things that we think are more important, and we're not treating content as an important thing to do in and of itself, that has its own strategy, that has its own reasoning behind it, and there's achieving things that we want our organizations to achieve. So it's publishing with intent, knowing how to do search engine optimization, how to make social media content that isn't just telling people to come and buy tickets, and generally using the internet to its best effect. And if I had to sum up what a content strategy is in one sentence, be targeted content on appropriate channels for your audience that serves the whole user journey, achieves your objectives, and avoids wasting loads of time on content that doesn't do anything. That is what I would describe as a content strategy. I had to find a website that still does word art from like Windows 97 because Windows doesn't do good word art anymore. If anyone wants me to share that website afterwards, please just give me a shout. But if you want something a bit more organized, I do quite like this diagram of the content strategy from Brain Traffic, splitting into editorial, experience, structure, and process, with the idea that you need systems designed well enough to support your content, but you obviously also need to be designing content that people actually want to engage with and represent what you are and what you want to do. And these are the 4 areas I'll be delving into after a little bit of groundwork that I think you need to do for a strategy. You could also use any number of disgusting consultant diagrams to show you what we're trying to do. Many of you in the room might already be aware of the marketing funnel, which I usually call the engagement funnel, to not scare off people in organizations. But the idea is that your content strategy should be serving every single layer of this funnel, with the idea that no one is going to do anything with you if they're not aware that you exist in the first place. But you can't be all things for all people, and only a certain amount of people who are aware of you will then be interested in what you do. You then need to provide opportunities for them to consider doing things with you, whether that's following you or buying something from you, going to your website, signing up to a newsletter, whatever kind of objective or connection you're trying to make. And then only some of those will actually end up doing that connection after consideration. And then ideally you're nurturing that relationship so they stay in a relationship with you, because as we all know, it's easier to keep a retained customer, if I can use that word, than to get new people interested in you. But you can easily fail at each level of this funnel by not having the right and appropriate content for people to make the decision to keep going deeper. So if you get bowled over by the sheer amount of words I'm about to spew at you, then you can always come back to this funnel and say, well, actually, content strategy is just making sure that we're doing this funnel. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is inspiration from design thinking. You might have seen double diamond diagrams with the idea that you're starting with a problem you're trying to solve. Usually a strategy is trying to take advantage of some sort of opportunity or tackle some sort of problem. You then need to do some research to discover some insights into that problem, and then scope down and focus on what is really important for you and how you define that problem very definitely and how it relates to you. And then you start designing solutions to attack that problem. So you eventually spit out a solution, which in this case is a content strategy. So my subtitle slides probably aren't the most appropriate. What the hell are we trying to do? This is a section all about actually trying to define the problem that you're trying to attack. And it's worth coming up with a problem statement, which is very simply laying out what is your ideal situation? Where would you like to be if you made a content strategy? And you can usually figure that out by also moving into what is holding you back from that ideal situation. I sometimes use this thing called a evaluation boat, which sounds terrible, but it's what are the anchors holding your boat back from where you're trying to get to, and what is the wind in your sails, and then prioritizing the exact thing that you want to solve. And it could just be that we know loads of organizations are attracting new audiences online and getting a high profile and whatever, but we're not quite sure what to do. It can be as simple as that. We just don't even know where to start. We don't know who we're trying to reach. We don't know what is important to us when we're publishing content online. And that's a problem statement that you need to solve through this process. There's also no point embarking on a digital content strategy if you're not sure who you're trying to do it for. And it's very important to keep your audience at the heart of it rather than just your organization, because you can very easily make a content strategy that does everything that you want to achieve, and then you put it out on the internet and you realize that nobody cares because you haven't actually taken into consideration the people you're trying to reach. And most of you are probably already aware of segmentation, the idea that you can't appeal to absolutely everybody in the world as much as we try. And it's sometimes easier to segment your audiences into particular interests or motivations or demographics, so that you can say, well, we're crafting this content series like articles or social media, or even how we use an entire channel directed particularly at this segment or this age group. And there's a bit of a shilling opportunity. The audience agency does run our own segmentation system with Audience Spectrum, which is organized according to how people consume arts and culture. But if you don't want to get too intense with your segmentation, you could really pare it back. And we always recommend that you start simple and build on it to see whether this works for you, or if you need to get a bit more complicated. And the classic is simply people who already do things with us and people who don't do things with us. And then asking questions of these two audience types. What do the people who already do things with us need from us in terms of our content? If they're already interested in what we do and they like us and they do things with us, they probably need quite practical information, maybe opportunities to dig deeper. People who don't do things with us, we need to convince them to do things with us. But what are they interested in? What are their gain points? What are their pain points? And what kind of content can we create that actually makes them want to follow us and visit our website, sign up to newsletters, and get into a relationship with us? Polyamorous relationship with the entire public. If you want to get even more intense, you can use something like an Ansoff Matrix, which is essentially, you can use this to plot content or even plot your audiences. It's organized from existing to new in terms of audiences and products and program. So in your bottom left square here, you've got existing audiences with your existing program. So you don't need to change your program necessarily, but you might need to connect them more deeply with it. So maybe they come more often or just engage with you more deeply. Top left, you've got new audiences with your existing program. So you say, we already do this thing, and we think this new audience might find it interesting, but we need to convince them. So how do we message it? How do we target them? How do we find out where they live on the internet? And bottom right, you've got new program for your existing audience. So taking what you already know about your existing audience and thinking, well, what else can we offer them that's new based on what we already know? And then you've got your brand new diversification in the top right, new audiences and new products. I'm terrified I'm about to hear the postman come to the door, because I chucked my phone away when I was trying to swat away a wasp a couple of days ago, and they bricked it, and it's meant to be arriving today. So if I run away for a minute, that'll be why. Once you've got an idea of who you're actually trying to attract, and I've got a bit more in this presentation about how you can actually do some audience research, it's worth figuring out where you stand at the moment as well. So what the hell is actually happening on your content channels at the moment? And we can start with is who are you reaching and not reaching? This is what this entire section is about. It's trying to figure out who you're reaching and not reaching. What are you posting at the moment? Why are you posting what you post? And how are you currently posting? A bit of a slimmed down version of that 4-square diagram I showed you earlier. So WWWH, who, what, why, how. And you can usually figure out a lot of that through a content audit. But first you need to identify the key metrics across social media, web, and your newsletter that are most interesting to you. So you want more people on your website, then you should probably look looking at how people make it to your website, what kind of click-throughs you're getting from different social media channels. You want people to actually do stuff on your website, you should be looking at events and conversions and how many people are actually making it to the end and doing the thing you'd like them to do. You want people to just enjoy your stuff, so you're trying to raise awareness and get people to engage, then you should be looking at engagement and engagement rates. So not just the number of engagements, but how well something is engaged with, either compared to the amount of followers you have on a particular channel or the amount of people that post reached. And you want more people to look at your stuff, in which case it's, reach, impressions, potentially follower growth. And if you want different people to look at your stuff, you may be wanting to track demographics of your social media followers or website audience for Google Analytics or your newsletter demographics. Where you get this kind of data is essentially logging into too many websites for your sanity, usually pulling the data together in a chaotic spreadsheet, trying to track it, the common metrics across all channels. The point is in how you analyze it, seeing where you're overperforming or underperforming, and creating your own insights about why the numbers are the way that they are. Why might you be performing better on Facebook than Twitter when it comes to click-throughs? Is it because of how the platform's designed, or is it a particular way you're doing content, or is it because there's an audience on there that is just more susceptible to your program than you have on Twitter, that kind of thing? So you could be ending up with semi-fancy graphs, which tell you all of these things, but it's having this data ready to inform how you design your strategy afterwards. And making insights, like this is from a real organization I was doing something with a few months ago, where they have a ton of engagement, where they have the most engagement on Twitter, but very few link clicks. But also they did tons more on Twitter than they did in every other channel. So you would expect there to be more engagement potentially, but they're not necessarily getting as much bang for their buck as they are for Facebook and Instagram, where the engagement rate is much higher and where they're getting a lot more click-throughs than they are in their other channels. So they may then want to pivot more to Facebook and Instagram as their main channels than Twitter, which is probably a sentiment that almost all of us are currently going through at the moment. Once you've identified your audience as well, you can start digging a little bit deeper into who they are and what they do, because digital analytics are kind of crap at figuring out the motivations of audiences. They're very good at telling us their actions and how many people you've reached. But you can't reach for the screen, shake them by the shoulders and say, well, why did you click on that post? Why did you like this one but not this one? That's why it's worth doing simple surveys, ideally with an incentive. something from the shop, maybe even like a cash prize, digging into what people want, how they want it, and why. So you're really figuring out among all these different demographics of your audiences, what do they consume more widely on the internet in terms of content? What do they want from you specifically as an organization? And obviously why they actually want to do those things. And if that's not enough information for you, you could also run simple focus groups to get deeper insights, potentially even putting content in front of those people to say, well, how would you react to this? What more would you want to know about this piece of content? What do you think we're trying to tell you with this, etc. I've kind of conflated audience and accessibility in one, even though they should have probably been 2 slides, but we'll just run with it. Because you can also run user testing on your current content and the website to figure out where things might be going well and where they might be falling down, which can be as simple as just pulling people from the gallery or theatre floor. If you're struggling for people, even just getting friends and family, your cat or dog, sit them in front of a computer and say, I'd like you to try and buy a ticket or find out about this topic or do this other thing, and seeing where they stumble and what works well on that journey. You also need to look at how accessible your website and your content in general is. And there are lots of free tools to gauge things like reading level of your text, how visible particularly your website content is for people with visual impairments and color blindness, and also readability, so using things like alt text in your images, both on social and your website. It's also worth feeling what other people are doing. So looking at your main competitors, whether they're inside or outside the sector, even people that you just think do a really good job, but looking at kind of themes they post on, what formats they're using, if there's anything you can learn from them, whether they concentrate on particular channels. Also, again, thinking your insight there to say, well, what can we learn from what these organizations are doing? What are they doing well? What are they not doing so well? What are the correlations between us and them? And how can we take some of the best of what they do and apply it to what we do? It's also not just about the content itself and the audiences, because your staff will need to be involved in the content process as well. I do quite like using structured interviews just to get under the skin of what people actually think about how the organization is using content, their experience of it, what they think it should be achieving, what they think it's doing at the moment. And I say structured interviews, it's just a fancy way of saying planning what you're going to ask people. But you could be asking them gain and pain points when they're contributing to content, how it affects their objectives, whether they think it actually adds value to their jobs or not, how deep is their understanding of the point of it, and whether they need to be convinced or have it made more relevant to their roles, and then writing up the key takeaways to bring into your strategy to make sure that when you're looking at governance and how you communicate the strategy, that you're speaking to the points that you've taken from these interviews. I had a Popeyes chicken thing yesterday for lunch, which made me feel very dirty, but it was also very nice. I've also got this thing down in the bottom right corner called a RACI framework, which is essentially a way of looking at who's responsible, accountable, and who needs to be informed and consulted about content or any other topic. And it could be a way that you segment your own staff to see who you need to talk to make sure it's not just the people doing content, but say the directors who are accountable for it, or curators or producers or wherever it might be that need to be consulted because you're trying to use their stories or their work in your content, and who just needs to be informed. So they don't necessarily need to be particularly involved, but they need to know what you're achieving and how it's going and what the point of it all is. But that's quite intense research phase. Could take a few days, spread out over a few weeks, maybe, if you're doing it internally. But then once you've got all that data, once you've got all those insights sitting on a load of different documents, once ideally you've had some sort of discussion with the right people, it is a case of what do now, which is the name of the next section, what do now. And you can use all of that insight and data and hone it into little points. One method is using the SOAR analysis, which is like our old friend, the SWOT analysis, but a bit more optimistic. So based on everything you found out, what are your current strengths? Where are you doing well? Whether that's in terms of staff engagement, what do you understand about your audience? How are you using particular channels, particular formats? What are your aspirations? What do you think you could be doing better? Where would you like to be in terms of what you found out about how things are going? What are the opportunities? So what are your wider business objectives, and where do you think you could be doing a better job and really making a difference? You could have found out that you're really doing well with a particular audience, and there's an opportunity there to just really gun for that. And also, what are the results that you're looking for? How do we know when you're actually succeeding if you're running after these opportunities and aspirations? As a small example, my manager in my previous job, Louise Cohen at the Royal Academy of Arts, then set out objectives for the organisation, which is very similar to the marketing/engagement funnel that I showed you earlier, saying, well, we're trying to look to grow our audiences, deepen them, convert them, and retain them. And each of those has different audiences and different types of content to try and draw them into each of those objectives. And you could do something similar by doing a logic model, which if you've ever had to do a National Lottery Heritage Fund project, you'll be well familiar with. But the idea of moving backwards logically. So if you go back to that problem statement that I recommended making at the beginning of the project, you could work backwards from that problem statement to say, well, if we're trying to solve this problem or take advantage of this opportunity, what kind of impacts are we trying to achieve? Which could be anything from we are financially solvent, things like that. We are engaging with X communities and they are a valued member of the organization, whatever it is. It's a terrible example. And working backwards from those impacts, what kind of measurable outcomes will actually demonstrate them? What are things that you can track, whether it's through audience surveys or digital analytics or whatever tools you've got to bear? And then what kind of outputs will lead to those objectives, those outcomes and impacts? So in terms of actual content, what kind of formats and themes and other things do you actually need to be producing to get those kinds of measurable outcomes? And what kind of activities support those outputs? So do you need training? Do you need people assigned to it? How will those outputs actually get achieved? And equally then, what kind of inputs do you need to make that happen? So do you need specific amount of staff time, particular resource, equipment? There's no point saying you can achieve the world if you don't actually have the resource to do it. And a way of getting that resource is by proving that you've thought through how this impacts your organization, the kind of things you're going to achieve, but it's saying, well, we need these extra things, otherwise we can't make all these lovely things happen. But once you've got that direction, and this is the kind of thing you could be filling out over the course of what I'm just about to tell you in these next 4 sections, I'm going to focus on the editorial experience, structure, and process. Because once you've got an idea of what you're trying to achieve, you're usually also looking at the strengths and weaknesses of each of these areas and which bits you need to tweak and where you need to do something new. So to start with structure, it's looking at how your content is organized and categorized, which could be, anything from how you organize your articles, but also how you categorize social media themes. Does that make sense? I think I've got that right. But also what tools you use. Do you have the right tools? Is your website CMS up to scratch? Do you have the right e-commerce system? Do you have the right ticketing system? Do you need an e-newsletter system or social media management tool? Do you have the right equipment? How is your content delivered? You need to have things like members only areas on your website. It's just making sure that you actually have the tools at your disposal to achieve your ambitions, which is exactly what this slide says. It's quite handy. And making sure that your current capabilities match your actual ambitions. I feel like I've essentially just said pretty much all of these. It's almost looking at those inputs. If we go back to the logic model, if you're saying that you want a very slick look to your content, then you're probably going to need some training. You might need specialist creative software. If one of your objectives is to reduce the amount of time that you spend on things, then you're probably going to have to invest in something like a social media management tool, but it all depends on your specific circumstances and making sure that you're not planning something you can't actually achieve. And a good way of figuring out some of your gaps is by running digital culture compass workshops, which is a tool from Arts Council England, which is free online and is designed for organisations of pretty much any size and type to do internally, or you can pay someone to come in and do it for you. But looking at all areas of your organisation, not just in terms of content, scoring yourself on your digital maturity and identifying an action plan for filling in some of those gaps. But you could do it and just focus on the communications and marketing section. Part of this, you could also be doing a skills audit. If you're in heritage particularly, I'd recommend using the DASH survey from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which is very good at highlighting the different strengths and gaps that you've got in your organisation, and how you can talk about it as an organisation and give you a bit of a pointer of where you need to go next. But you could also just nick some of the questions and make your own for an internal one, if you'd like. That brings us on to process. So even if you've got the tools, it's also how you use the tools and how you get ideas. And I'm going to put these all out because otherwise I'll save them and forget them. Not just practically how content is birthed into the world, but how you're managing your governance and letting the right stakeholders know what's happening and what they need to do, how you can report against success. In terms of getting content from A to B, how do you report against success? Should probably been the last bullet point in this, to be honest. But it's looking at your metrics from earlier in your research. What are you trying to achieve? What are the key ones you need to focus on? Rather than being led by the metrics by saying, well, say social media gives us these 50 metrics. Rather than reporting against all of them, you're only reporting against the ones that actually demonstrate your impacts. But you're also looking at providing policies which make the process of creating content really clear. So you say, like, maybe this thing is discussed in a workshop and then we assign a person to it and there's a workflow for them getting that drafted and reviewed and posted online. But also how you get buy-in from colleagues, how you invite people into the process, how you keep them informed, and actually asking yourself, do you need a governance process? If you're a very small organization, you probably don't need a really complicated workflow because there might just be 3 of you doing it and you can just have a conversation in the office or on Teams. It's worth asking yourself, do you need that formal process? Which, as the more sensitive campaigns or the more bureaucratic the organization is, you probably do. And whether you need a formal process or if you need a more informal get-together for creative brainstorming, does your executive team or your board need an overview of what you're doing? And they probably don't need to know absolutely everything. You don't need to send them daily updates on what you've been posting. It's more saying we've put the strategy in front of you to keep us honest. We're going to report to you quarterly or maybe annually to say, we said we're going to try and reach for these impacts. Here's how we did, and here's our write-up on it. And they can give you broad direction on which direction you take. But you probably need then more meetings and workshops, which are much more about coming up with the ideas and month to month pivoting based on what your data is telling you. You might need a mixture of all 3 of these. Maybe you've got a formal process for very important campaigns. The rest of your content is a bit more ad hoc and informal. And then you need the exec at the top. You should be exploring how you make decisions on actual roadmap of activity, how far ahead you're actually capable of planning. Should it be weekly, monthly, quarterly, or annually? Maybe you have big things coming up in the calendar and you're saving time for that. But you might have more of a reactive style week to week. You should be identifying risks and opportunities. And that's where it is worth getting senior management involved, because it's very easy to wade into social media crises or into topics which the organization isn't comfortable with. And it's worth setting those red lines in your governance structure first. Also, staff responsibilities. who's going to be looking at the data, who's going to be involved in actually publishing the content, who just needs to hear what's happening with it, and how you communicate how you're doing to the rest of the organization. Do you maybe hold an open presentation every couple of months? Do you send email digests saying, well done, this colleague, your idea or this piece of content did really well. This thing didn't do so well for these reasons, and here's what we're doing about it. And also giving yourself a structure to say no to certain things, which is one of the biggest powers that we can have. If you have a governance structure and you say this is how we do things and there's a workflow and a process, and we're posting on these themes and we do it in this way, it's much easier then to say no to things that fall out of that structure. It's also a good forum for discussing among a group who's been agreed they can talk about these things, or whether to adopt innovations and new tech. So threads would be a perfect example. Who are the people that you need to say, well, we're going to keep a watch on this thing and see how it goes, or we think it's worth investing in because we've looked at our audiences and our type of content and we think it's worth it, or we're just going to ignore it because it's not for us, rather than everyone saying all the time, are we going to be on Threads? Are we going to be on TikTok? You have a forum for actually making those decisions. And depending on how hardcore you want to go, you may need some policies around particular areas. You may have gaps in how you're currently working. And it could be everything from your voice and tone through to style guides, how you deal with trolling and harassment, how you organize your file and media storage, how you deal with copyright and intellectual property rights. It all depends on your specific circumstances and what's come out of that audit. But it's also worth, it's not just worth, it's essential that you're actually keeping to legal obligations as well. It's worth identifying what you think you need and what you don't think you need in terms of policies, particularly for new starters. And like I said earlier, for that audience slide, when you're thinking of who does what, you could use the RACI framework to say, well, these people are responsible for doing the content, these people are responsible for the data, these people are responsible for setting the tone and direction. Maybe people from other teams are consulted when we need to use some of their content or involve them. It all depends on your organization. And there's a classic content lifecycle, because your governance structure needs to be supporting the rhythm of how content is made, which is a cyclical planning period. You're designing what you're trying to do based on what you're trying to achieve and which audiences you're trying to reach. You need to publish the content, then evaluate it, and then look back on how that did to strategize what you do next. And if you don't have a structure that works in this way, then you're probably going to come across a lot of different roadblocks when you're planning your content, because you need that time for each of these stages. Otherwise, you'll never learn from what went well and what didn't go well in your previous cycle. And you also decide that you need a bit more of a process about how you plan your campaigns. But getting it, I find it useful to think of content in these three terms, that you have an always on type of content, the stuff that you're always going to be talking about, and you know you're going to be talking about it. So you have consistent formats that say maybe happen every week or every month. But you also have time limited campaigns where you say, well, it's just for this exhibition or this show. It's just about that, and it's usually got a very specific objective, whereas you're always on, maybe more about raising awareness and engagement more generally with the organization. And then particularly when it comes to social media is the importance of being reactive. So when trends happen, how can you react quickly? And how can you react quickly without going through a torturous approval process, which is usually by agreeing those kind of policies and red lines beforehand, so you're trusted to actually post on things without that approval process. And when you're actually doing the work, how you collaborate is usually the messiest bit. How you actually keep track of where content is, what stage it's at, who's actually assigned to do it, and when it's going out. This will all depend on your organization and how much of an anal planning freak you are. So you could just be using an Excel sheet, could be using a calendar. There are tools like Trello or Airtable where you can assign people specifically to bits of content and color code and categorize them. But ideally, you'd have some way where you can say, we know what's coming up, we know what's being published, we know who's in charge, and we know who to complain to when it's not actually finished. Our last bit of processing is reporting at the end. And again, it's a piece of string. It could be just an email saying, I've looked at the data, here are my insights. If you need to report to a wider group, then you might need to do something a bit more epic. Like this is an example of the kind of thing we used to do at the Royal Academy of Arts. So we've got like targets, we can see the trends from previous months, but it's pointless without the insight on top of it. If you put a ton of graphs in front of people, they're just going to fall asleep. So you need to be actually explaining data, talking it through, and then actually acting on it as well. Which brings us to experience. There's only just an editorial left. I'm conscious, like I said, I've just been talking at you for absolutely ages. Experience is looking at user journeys, user needs and motivations, accessibility, and which content formats and channels work for your audiences in terms of how they experience them. So it's much more about the design and accessibility. And user experience is essentially just making things more easier and enjoyable for what users already want to do. It's making sure there's a clear path, say, through to your website from your social media channels. And when they land on the website, it's very clear and easy for them to do what they want to do and to browse and understand what they're looking at. It does require you thinking through what do you want users to do and also understanding what they want to do and making sure that, like I say, the navigation and the design of that is as good as it can be, which means you might need to do a bit of research into current user journeys and how effective they are. Looking at your Google Analytics, seeing where people are dropping off pages, whether people are coming onto pages, clicking through to a certain extent, and then just abandoning you, that kind of thing. But also, are your current content formats well received by audiences? Are they filmed on potatoes? Is your graphic design subpar, like mine is? And those are the kind of insights you can only really get by putting these things in front of people and asking them directly through things like focus groups. And then obviously, is your content is accessible by default by anyone who identifies with a disability, which could involve asking about your design approach, which gets into a whole question about branding of the organization, which is why I said at the very beginning that this kind of work very often can result in just spilling out into other areas of the organization. So it's how much you can fix easily without turning it into a 10-year project. Looking at user journeys, a good way of doing it is identifying goals on your website. So you might say, want people to read articles, watch videos, buy tickets, download a learning resource, sign up to a newsletter, that kind of thing. If you set those up as events and conversions on your Google Analytics, and then you can test how many people are actually doing those things that you want them to do, and which ideally they would want to do as well. And there's nothing better for testing that than doing some live testing with real people, as I went through earlier, of sitting them down, seeing how they go about the task, and seeing what could be fixed. Which brings me to editorial. This is really what most people think when they consider content strategy, because it's looking at voice and tone, it's what you're actually making content about, and perhaps more crucially, what you're not making content about, what you're trying to change in the world with your mission and how you message it, and your standards and style. It is really all about just making sure you have the right content for the right people, and ideally at the right time. So what do you and don't you talk about? You as an organization, you can't talk about everything in the world, but what is very important to you, but also what is important to your audiences. What are people searching for when they get to your website? What are people talking about when they're talking with you on social media? How can you reflect their interests and what they're interested in? And there's also a question of how you present yourself to the world. If you're an organization with a lot of history, then your tone of voice might be informed by that history and that relationship you have with your audiences. If you're trying to break into a new audience, then you might need to adapt your voice and tone to what they respond with. If you're using particular social media channels, one type of voice and tone may work on one place, but not necessarily another. You might have a load of older 65 plus people following you on Facebook who wouldn't particularly like the tone that you have on Instagram. So that's essentially what voice and tone is. You have your overarching voice, and then how you apply that as a tone to different channels. And also which audiences and voices are prioritized. So going back to your audience research, which audiences' needs are you prioritizing with your content? And where is your focus lying? It all feeds into your style and approach. In terms of formats, I love this thing called the content matrix, which is the idea that you don't, some people find themselves stuck in one corner of this matrix because it's a safe place. But if you remember back to the marketing engagement funnel, you need different types of content for different stages of that journey. You might need more entertaining content to keep people entertained and interested in you and finding out for you for the first time and having a good time and then following you and going to your website. You may need to inspire them by sharing what other people are saying about you, making sure that you're keeping track of your reviews online. You may need to convince people to actually do stuff with you, which is saying, well, look at how amazing this experience is. Here's what other people have been saying about it. And you may need to educate people. So infographics, how-tos, learning resources, whatever works for your organization. But it's the idea that you need a spread in almost all cases to be hitting different types of audiences at different times. If you're going purely for the education, then you're probably missing out on a ton of other audiences. You can see that with some of these case studies, like Black Country Living Museum, most popular museum on TikTok, have really made use of their strengths and their niche with the actors and volunteers they have on site, to not just entertain people with their TikTok videos, but also inform them about life and history in the Black country. Wellcome Collection have really focused on the importance of long form stories for their perhaps more sophisticated audience. I don't know if they'd like me saying that, but they want deep dive stories written by professional writers and bloggers, and they've gunned for that by having a very specific approach to commissioning digital content. It's worth reading the blog when you get the slides afterwards. And also take who rapidly realized that just piggybacking on the main Tate site wasn't going to work, probably both for SEO reasons, but also because it gave them more freedom in branding and the type of content they could produce. So having their own website, which is wildly popular with the audience they're really gunning for. And Royal Institution were one of the most successful YouTube channels in science communication, taking advantage of the fact that science is obviously best when conveyed with passion, but also when you can see the results in front of you. So not just relying on static images and paragraphs of scientific text, but saying here are real scientists doing real science and explaining it in a relevant and engaging way for you, and really running with that. The thing that most of my editorial approaches always boiled down to, if you excuse the swearing, is asking myself, do I give a F? It feels so naff to say F, even though it's written on screen. And this really, for me, gets to the heart of it, in that if you're trying to get an audience to read something that you've created, watch it, whatever it is, you need to get out of your own mindset and out of what you know and what you enjoy, and think, if this was put in front of a person I'm trying to reach, would they stop and actually care about this post? Are we giving them a reason to care? And that gets all into all kinds of issues of what is relevant to that person, what kind of style of writing or imagery or video do they like? Have we pulled out the right hooks for them? Have we done search engine optimization on our website content? And it's much more, it's having that background of research on your audience and content formats and what you do already done and in your head, and then sorting your processes so that you have this check, asking yourself, is this the right content for this person that I'm trying to write for? And how do I make it got its best chance to actually get someone to stop and consume it and ideally enjoy it? So, to conclude, most strategies do end up as a stack of documents on a shelf, but it's more the process of actually going through it. And as something to put into the hands of stakeholders or even new starters, something to refer to when you're stuck. But most strategy is that lived process. It's being armed with that understanding and the organization's agreement on the approach and having that structure for keeping you on track with your agreed topics and themes and formats and channels, who you're trying to reach, who does it, how that workflow works. That'll be something that you stress test and adapt to every day and every week. But you need that bedrock before you get into that habit of Sisyphus pushing his rock up the hill every single day, which is basically what doing content feels like. That said, you will probably need something like a roadmap of activity relating to those 4 areas I talked about. So it's not built in a day. Some of these things will probably need an action plan where you're prioritizing what you need to sort out first, what things you can do as you go, and I don't know where I was going with the rest of that sentence. Getting your policies and procedures written down, again, part of that action plan. And also, again, it's as much about the curation as it is about having a document to refer to. Just getting to ask each other that question: how do we want to present ourselves? How do we write 19th century? Do we use a TH? Do we just write it out? Doing that accessibility audit, making sure people stick to your accessibility guidelines, how your procedures of approvals work within your organization, and which all ties into that governance structure and how you run that content lifecycle, including how you report and how you keep just adapting and improving as you go all the time. I feel like a lot of this talk has been quite dry, and there have actually been very few examples of content, but it's worth saying at the end that the whole point of this work, the whole point of doing the more dull stuff around processes and governance structures and all the rest is to give you that freedom to create amazing content with purpose. So you're not casting around thinking, is this the right thing to do? Am I going to be fired for sending off this tweet? There's clarity, but there's also freedom to know that you're gunning for an audience, taking advantage of an opportunity, and there's a roadmap for how you do it. And you know it's something that your audience are receptive to because you've done your research and you've been reporting on your data, however often you're capable of doing it. And ideally, you'd have the organization on board. Always that's it. I do have some links